So in this first section, if we wanted to underline all of the nouns, it would look something like this. There's also several cases where the existential there is used kind of like a dummy pronoun, as when we have the predicate in front of the subject. And in different sentences here, we see objects of prepositions, we see direct objects, and there's a subject in each one of these. So let's go ahead and label the subjects. In the first one, cat is the subject. This sentence could read, a tiny cat with a plastic bag over its paws, that would be the complete subject, was in the bushes. There's our complete predicate. Instead, we have this complete predicate first, and then the complete subject. In the next one, theaters is the subject. In the one after that, it's the officer that is actually issuing the ticket, if you look at the verb and identify who's completing that action. And in the next one, Mr. Brown is the subject. So we're kind of in this predicate then subject mode, or some of these are in the passive voice. It's the book of poems that sat on the top shelf, or the quarters that were in the jar, and Joanne that actually mops the floor. The next section is about subject complements. So those might be nouns or pronouns or adjectives, but we know they all are connected with linking verbs to the subject and they describe the subject. So let's go ahead and underline all the nouns or pronouns in these sentences. So in each of these, we're trying to connect the subject to a description of that subject. And some of them, like pleasant, are subject complements, even though they're not nouns. That describes the neighbor. Creatures describes we. Doctor describes Paulette. Car is the subject complement that describes the prize. Quarterback describes Melvin. Citizen describes brother. Teenager describes Max. Next up, direct objects. So all of these have action verbs, and more specifically transitive action verbs. So we're looking for a noun after that action verb that answers the question what or who. First, let's underline all the nouns and pronouns that are functioning as nouns. Here's what all those nouns look like. The one that might kind of stand out is this adverbial phrase here. If you wanted to call that whole thing an adverb, I wouldn't stop you. But let's go through and label the direct objects. Hand answers the question raised what? Grows what? Tomatoes. Found what? A garage. Chose who? Butkins. Contains what? Jokers. Has what? A ring. Pleaded what? The case. Those are all direct objects. Next up, the indirect objects. Here we have two objects or nouns that come after a verb, and the what is generally the direct object, and the who is generally the indirect object. But first, let's look at all the nouns and pronouns functioning as nouns. And this section makes it pretty clear that many of these nouns have articles, a, an, or the in front of them. So that's a pretty good tip to help you find the nouns. If we pay attention to the action verbs, Jill's father bought. What did he buy? A rod. Who did he buy it for? Her. Coffee gives what? Strength. To who? Herb. Miss Whipple asked. Asked what? A question. To who? Jim. The president gave. Gave what? A keepsake. To who? Each cabinet member. Mr. Bubbles handed. Handed what? The keys. To who? The contestant. The people found what? A home. For who? The displaced family. Next up, object complements. These are like subject complements, but instead of describing the subject, they describe a direct object. So therefore, we have to have a transitive action verb and a direct object for one of these to even show up. They're generally nouns or adjectives, but they could be a pronoun also. First, let's underline all the nouns or pronouns functioning as nouns. So the direct object in this first one is man, and brilliant describes that man. Friendly describes Mary. Quite odd describes Henry. Those are all adjectives. Thief describes Phyllis. President describes Lisa. Criminal describes Princess Elsa. Notice those are all nouns. And sleeping describes the guard, which is a verbal acting like an adjective. This next section, we're getting away from nouns and pronouns, and we're underlining the simple predicate. And then we're going to label these action verbs as either transitive or intransitive. So when it comes to simple predicate, that's the main verb like dipped or works, including any helping verbs like has spilled or will have ridden, and not including adverbs like often or never. They're part of the verb phrase, but not part of the simple predicate. To figure out if these are transitive or intransitive, we look after the verb to see if there's a noun there that answers the question what or who. And watch out for prepositional phrases that trick you. So dipped what? Their heads, therefore it's transitive. Works, intransitive. Has spilled, and see these are prepositional phrases, so there's not actually a noun there, intransitive. Will have ridden her bicycle, transitive. Were often lying, notice the prepositional phrases, this is intransitive. Has never brought her dog, that's transitive. Here are the simple predicates in the next section, and we have to determine whether they are action verbs or linking verbs. So notice tall describes the redwoods. Grow links that description to the subject. Sustained is an action verb here. Would you say that injury describes the gymnast? Probably not. Optimistic, though, does describe Tom. And coffee beans are what Junior smelled, so that's another action. Morris tasted the soup. You can see an action occurring there. Notice did and seem is separated because it's asking a question, but feverish does describe Joe, so this serves as a linking verb. And this last one's kind of tricky because are looking could be are as a helping verb, looking as the main verb. But does uncomfortable describe the horses? We're talking about their appearance and not an action here. So I would argue that this phrase, this verbal looking quite uncomfortable, functions as a subject complement, and are is the linking verb there. If it said the horses are looking across the meadow, now we're talking about an action, and are would be helping and looking would be action. But this one is more linking. Let's classify some pronouns. She is a personal pronoun. Who here is a relative pronoun. Or in the next one, it's an interrogative pronoun. That can be a relative pronoun like here. It can also be a demonstrative pronoun, as in that book was missing. One another is a reciprocal pronoun. Someone is indefinite. So is all when we're talking about indefinite pronouns. Himself, used as the direct object, is reflexive. And himself, emphasizing the subject, is considered intensive. There's lots of personal pronouns and indefinite pronouns in particular. All of the ones, bodies, and things are indefinite pronouns. It would be an impersonal pronoun under this category. One, as long as they're not counting, would arguably be an indefinite pronoun. The relative pronouns are like who, that, and which. They replace the noun in front of them and begin a dependent clause. The interrogative pronouns ask questions having to do with what or who. The demonstrative pronouns are like this, that, these, and those. There's only two reciprocal pronouns, one another and each other. And reflexive intensive pronouns always end in self, and they depend on how they're used. If it's functioning as the direct object, reflecting the action of the verb back onto the subject, that's reflexive. If it's intensifying the subject by emphasizing, that's intensive. This last section is a little bit different. We're going to underline nouns, pronouns, and articles used as determiners. So remember that articles are the words a, an, or the. So John's car and the highway specify which car and which highway you're talking about, in the same way that her phone does, or the weather. And that essay and an a are all dogs. Notice they're functioning like adjectives here, but they don't have comparative forms. They're not really descriptive. They're just identifying either which one or clarifying the relationship between which car or which highway or which phone or which weather we're talking about. Some, most, bills, to, this, and a all function as determiners. Those, the, our, my, its, the, whose, what, are all determiners. Notice in each case they come in front of nouns. So that's the difference between a pronoun all by itself, like what or those, or whether it's functioning as a determiner. It's in front of a noun. Like this, for example, is just functioning as a noun, or it is different than the possessive its. So again, determiners are modifying words that determine the kind of reference a noun or noun group has. Oh, we almost forgot about which car, Ted's car, or your car. A couple more tricks. We can say blue, bluer, or bluest, but we don't really say that, thatter, or thatest. The comparative and superlative forms don't exist for determiners. Also, we can take descriptive adjectives out of sentences and they still make sense. But if we try to take out a determiner, we've lost the sentence. Car is fast doesn't make any sense.